The rain came down hard across the quiet neighborhood of Maple Ridge Estates, a picture-perfect suburban community just outside Dallas, Texas. Fresh-cut lawns, expensive SUVs parked neatly in driveways, American flags hanging proudly from front porches, and at the very end of Cedar Lane stood a small one-story brick home with faded shutters and a wheelchair ramp built along the front steps. That house belonged to retired Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks, a disabled U.S. Army veteran. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., Daniel rolled onto his front porch with a cup of black coffee and stared silently at the neighborhood waking up around him. He had survived 2 deployments overseas. He had survived an IED explosion that shattered his left leg. He had survived months of surgeries, rehabilitation, and nightmares that still woke him up drenched in sweat. But nothing prepared him for what the HOA was about to do. That morning, Daniel noticed an envelope taped to his front door. Bright red letters. Final notice. His stomach tightened instantly. He already knew who it was from. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. Specifically, HOA President Cynthia Holloway. The woman had been targeting him for months. First, it was complaints about his wheelchair ramp. Then complaints about his service dog Ranger barking at delivery trucks. Then complaints about the military decals on his garage. Then complaints about his grass being slightly uneven. Daniel slowly opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the page, and then his face went pale. Due to repeated violations and unpaid penalties totaling $18,430, the HOA hereby initiates legal proceedings to remove you from the property. Evict. They were trying to evict him. Daniel stared at the paper in disbelief. $18,000? Most of those fines had appeared out of nowhere. Daily penalties, administrative fees, late charges, community appearance violations. It was harassment disguised as paperwork. Ranger, his German Shepherd service dog, nudged against his leg as if sensing something was wrong. Daniel rubbed the dog's head silently. Then he noticed another line. If homeowner fails to comply within 14 days, foreclosure proceedings may begin. Foreclosure. They weren't just threatening him. They wanted his house. The same house he bought after returning from war. The same house where he learned how to walk again. The same house where his late wife spent her final Christmas before cancer took her away. Daniel's hands trembled. Across the street, neighbors quietly peeked through curtains. Nobody wanted trouble with the HOA, especially Cynthia Holloway. Cynthia ruled Maple Ridge like a dictator. Perfect blonde hair, designer clothes, always carrying a clipboard like she owned the neighborhood. And technically, she believed she did. At exactly 8 a.m., a black Mercedes SUV pulled into Daniel's driveway. Cynthia stepped out wearing sunglasses and a smug smile. Behind her walked 2 HOA board members carrying folders. Daniel stayed on the porch. Ranger stood protectively beside him. Cynthia looked at the wheelchair ramp with visible disgust. "Mr. Brooks," she said coldly, "I assume you received our notice." Daniel held up the letter. "You're trying to throw me out of my home." Cynthia crossed her arms. "You've ignored repeated warnings. These fines are fake. They are legally enforceable." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You know damn well I can't pay $18,000. Cynthia shrugged. "That's unfortunate." One of the board members looked uncomfortable. The other avoided eye contact entirely. Daniel took a slow breath. "I served this country for 14 years. Cynthia removed her sunglasses. "And this neighborhood values service very much," she said mechanically. "But rules apply to everyone." Daniel almost laughed. Rules? She was talking about rules to a man who nearly died wearing the American flag on his shoulder. "You fined me because my ramp paint didn't match the mailbox. It violated community standards. You fined me because Ranger barked during a thunderstorm. Nuisance animal complaints. You fined me because my military support flag was too large. Improper exterior display." Daniel stared at her. Then he noticed something. Several neighbors had slowly gathered outside, watching, listening, whispering. An older man named Frank Jensen stood near his driveway, shaking his head. A young mother across the street looked horrified. Cynthia noticed too. Her smile faded. "Mr. Brooks," she said louder, "this discussion is private." Daniel rolled forward slightly. "No, You taped an eviction notice on a disabled veteran's door. Now the neighborhood gets to hear why. The silence hit like thunder. One of the board members shifted nervously. Cynthia's expression hardened. You have 14 days. Then she turned and walked back toward her SUV. But before she entered the vehicle, Daniel spoke again. You know what's funny? She paused. I spent years overseas fighting people who abuse power. Never expected to come home and find it here. A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Cynthia slammed the SUV door. The vehicle sped away, but the damage had already begun. That afternoon, photos of Daniel's eviction notice started spreading online. Someone in the neighborhood had posted them in the local community Facebook group. Then someone shared them again. And again. Within hours, hundreds of comments flooded the page. An HOA is evicting a disabled veteran. This is disgusting. Who approved this? Shame on Maple Ridge HOA. Cynthia tried deleting posts. That only made people angrier. By evening, local veterans groups were reposting the story. A radio station mentioned it. Then a small local news page picked it up. Daniel sat quietly inside his living room watching the notifications explode on his old laptop. Ranger rested beside him. For the first time in months, Daniel realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. At 9:47 p.m., there was a knock at his door. Daniel opened it carefully. Standing outside were three neighbors. Frank Jensen, the young mother from across the street named Melissa, and a teenage boy holding a toolbox. Frank cleared his throat. Danny, we saw the post. Daniel stayed silent. Melissa stepped forward. We didn't realize what they were doing to you. The teenage boy lifted the toolbox. My dad says if they're complaining about your ramp, we can repaint it tomorrow. Daniel blinked. He hadn't heard kindness like that in a long time. Frank looked embarrassed. Truth is, most of us were scared of Cynthia. But this? He shook his head. This crossed the line. Daniel looked past them. More neighbors were standing outside, quietly, watching. Then another neighbor walked up carrying food containers. Another brought bottled water. Another asked if Daniel needed legal help. The crowd kept growing. And for the first time since his wife died, Daniel felt something inside his chest he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But across town, inside a luxury kitchen lit by expensive chandeliers, Cynthia Holloway stared furiously at her phone. Her inbox was exploding. Her voicemail was full. People were calling her a bully, a monster, a disgrace. One message made her especially angry. It came from another homeowner. If you can do this to a disabled veteran, what stops you from doing it to the rest of us? Cynthia gritted her teeth. Then she whispered something that would soon destroy her entire reputation. I'll make an example out of him. And she had no idea. The entire neighborhood was about to turn against her overnight. The next morning, Maple Ridge Estates didn't feel like the same neighborhood. People who normally rushed to work stopped in driveways whispering to each other. Garage doors stayed open longer. Phones stayed in hands. Everyone was talking about one thing, the HOA versus Daniel Brooks. By 7 a.m., Daniel opened his front door and froze. Nearly 20 neighbors stood outside his house. Some carried paint cans. Some carried lawn equipment. One man brought lumber. Another brought coffee. Frank Jensen waved. Morning, soldier. Daniel looked stunned. What is all this? Frank grinned. Community service. Within minutes, the neighborhood transformed into a volunteer crew. 2 teenagers repainted Daniel's wheelchair ramp. A retired contractor repaired loose fence boards. Melissa planted fresh flowers along the walkway. Someone pressure-washed the driveway. Another neighbor mowed the lawn with military precision. Daniel sat speechless on the porch watching complete strangers help him. And every single person helping him knew one thing. The HOA hated it. By 9:30 a.m., Cynthia's black Mercedes appeared at the end of the street. The entire neighborhood noticed immediately. The SUV slowed, then stopped. Cynthia stepped out wearing a furious expression. She stared at the crowd surrounding Daniel's home. What is going on here? She demanded. Nobody answered. A man continued painting. A teenager kept trimming bushes. Frank slowly sipped coffee. Cynthia marched toward the group. This gathering violates community parking regulations. Still nobody responded. Then Melissa finally looked at her. "We're helping our neighbor." Cynthia's face tightened. "This property remains under violation review." Frank laughed openly. "You mean the veteran you're trying to throw out?" Several neighbors nodded. Cynthia realized something dangerous in that moment. People were no longer afraid of her. That terrified her more than anything. She pointed toward Daniel. "This homeowner has repeatedly failed to comply with community standards." Daniel calmly rolled forward. "And what standard says disabled veterans shouldn't have wheelchair ramps?" Cynthia hesitated. "That's not what this is about." "Then explain it." Silence. The neighbors watched carefully. One woman began recording with her phone. Cynthia immediately noticed. "Turn that off." No. The word hit hard. Simple. Direct. Final. Cynthia suddenly looked less like a powerful HOA president and more like a cornered bully. Then Frank spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "My wife had cancer before she passed. Daniel shoveled our driveway every winter while fighting his own pain. And now you want to take his house." The crowd murmured angrily. Another neighbor stepped forward. "When my son got stranded during a storm, Daniel drove through flooded roads to help him." Another voice. "He helped fix my roof after the tornado warning." Another. "He babysat our dog during our emergency hospital trip." Story after story flooded out. Acts of kindness. Acts of sacrifice. Acts nobody ever talked about until now. Daniel looked overwhelmed. He genuinely hadn't expected any of this. But Cynthia saw something else. Her authority collapsing in real time. And then came the moment that changed everything. A silver pickup truck pulled into the neighborhood. Local news. 2 reporters stepped out holding cameras. Cynthia's face went pale instantly. The reporter approached Daniel first. "Mr. Brooks, is it true your HOA is attempting foreclosure over fines?" Daniel looked exhausted. "Yes." "And you're a disabled Army veteran?" "Yes." The reporter turned toward Cynthia. Would you like to comment?" Cynthia forced a fake smile. "The HOA values all residents equally. This is simply a legal compliance issue." Then the reporter asked the worst possible question. What exact violation justifies evicting a disabled veteran? Cynthia froze. The camera stayed locked on her face. The neighbors waited. No answer came, because there wasn't one. Finally, she snapped. "This homeowner has created ongoing disruption within the community." Daniel stared at her. "You mean existing?" The neighbors erupted. Even the cameraman looked uncomfortable. Cynthia turned red. "This interview is over." She stormed back toward her SUV, but the reporter shouted one final question. Did the HOA issue over $18,000 in fines related to accessibility modifications? Cynthia slammed her door. The SUV sped away again. And this time, everyone knew. The HOA president had just made a catastrophic mistake. By afternoon, the story exploded online. The news segment spread across Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and local forums. Comments poured in by the thousands. "Protect this veteran." HOA's out of control. This woman should resign immediately. Then came the real disaster. Military communities started sharing it. Veterans groups organized support. A legal nonprofit reached out to Daniel offering free representation. Then an even bigger surprise arrived. A law firm from downtown Dallas contacted him directly. One of the top property attorneys in Texas. Free of charge. Daniel sat quietly at his kitchen table holding the phone. "You're willing to represent me?" The attorney laughed softly. "Mr. Brooks, half my office are veterans. Your HOA picked the wrong fight." Meanwhile, inside the Maple Ridge clubhouse, panic spread through the HOA board. Board members argued loudly. One man slammed papers on the table. "You said this wouldn't become public." Another pointed at Cynthia. "You told us these fines were standard procedure." Cynthia tried maintaining control. Everyone calmed down. But nobody listened anymore. One board member looked genuinely frightened. "People are posting our names online." Another whispered, "My employer called me this morning asking questions." Cynthia realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. Then the clubhouse doors opened, and nearly 50 homeowners walked inside. Angry, focused, ready for war. Frank Jensen stood at the front. We want an emergency vote. Cynthia crossed her arms. For what? Frank stared directly at her. To remove you. The room exploded. Neighbors shouted over each other. You abuse your power. You targeted him for months. You embarrass this neighborhood. Cynthia pounded the table. Order. Nobody stopped. A woman held up printed screenshots of Daniel's fines. You charge him $500 because his service dog barked during fireworks. Another shouted. You fined him because his American flag was too visible. Cynthia looked trapped. Then she made the worst decision possible. She insulted the entire neighborhood. You people don't understand how communities are managed. Dead silence. Frank stepped forward slowly. No, Cynthia, we understand perfectly. You thought nobody would stand up to you. And in that moment, she realized the neighborhood had completely turned against her overnight. By the third day, the Maple Ridge HOA crisis had become national news. Cable news panels debated HOA abuse. Veterans organizations demanded investigations. Social media pages flooded with support for Daniel Brooks. But behind the scenes, something even bigger was happening. Something Cynthia Holloway never saw coming. At exactly 10:15 a.m., Daniel's attorney arrived at his house. Her name was Rebecca Torres. Sharpshoot, sharp eyes, and absolutely no patience or corruption. She rolled a thick stack of papers across Daniel's kitchen table. I reviewed every fine the HOA issued. Daniel leaned forward, and Rebecca smiled slightly. They're in serious trouble. Daniel blinked. What do you mean? Rebecca opened the folder. Several of these fines appeared to violate the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Daniel stayed silently. Rebecca continued. They fined you repeatedly for accessibility accommodations. That's potentially illegal discrimination. Daniel leaned back slowly. For months, Cynthia made him feel powerless, broken, helpless. Now, for the first time, the balance was shifting. Rebecca slid another document forward. But that's not even the interesting part. Daniel frowned. What else is there? Rebecca looked directly at him. Your HOA may not legally have authority over your property at all. The room went silent. Daniel stared at her. What? Rebecca pulled out old county maps. While researching Maple Ridge records, my office discovered a boundary discrepancy. She pointed at a highlighted section. Your property appears excluded from the original HOA annexation filing. Daniel frowned harder. You're saying... I'm saying they may have spent years finding a homeowner they never legally controlled. Daniel almost laughed in disbelief. You're kidding. I wish I was. Rebecca explained further. Years earlier, the developer who built Maple Ridge purchased multiple land parcels. But one section, including Daniel's lot, had complicated ownership history tied to an older veterans housing program. The paperwork was messy, very messy, and according to county records, Daniel's property may never have been fully transferred into HOA jurisdiction, meaning every fine, every threat, every violation notice might be legally worthless. Daniel sat speechless. Then he started laughing. Not angry laughter, not bitter laughter, pure disbelief. They tried to evict me from a neighborhood they might not even control. Rebecca nodded. And if this holds up in court, your HOA president just destroyed herself. Meanwhile, Cynthia Holloway was already unraveling. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Sponsors canceled the HOA's annual community fundraiser. Residents refused to pay dues. 3 board members threatened resignation. Then came another disaster. Someone leaked internal HOA emails, and the contents were explosive. One message from Cynthia read, Brooks lowers property values. Potential buyers don't want to see disability structures everywhere. Another email complained that military flags made the neighborhood look aggressive. The internet erupted. Now the story wasn't just about HOA abuse. It was about discrimination. Public outrage intensified overnight. Outside Cynthia's house, protesters began appearing with signs. Support veterans. Stop HOA corruption. Shame on Maple Ridge. News helicopters even circled above the subdivision. And still, Cynthia refused to back down. At an emergency HOA board meeting, she slammed both hands against the table. We are not surrendering to mob pressure. A board member looked terrified. Cynthia, federal investigators contacted us this morning. The room froze. What? The Department of Housing asked for records. Now even Cynthia looked nervous. Another board member whispered, "My wife says we should settle immediately." Cynthia snapped, "No." Then she made another catastrophic mistake. If we lose to him, every homeowner here will think they can ignore authority. That sentence changed everything, because sitting near the back of the room, someone was recording, and within hours, the audio leaked online. The public reaction became nuclear. Daniel, meanwhile, remained calm. For the first time since the war, he felt steady, focused, supported. Neighbors continued helping daily. Children left thank you cards on his porch. Veterans stopped by to shake his hand. One elderly Marine saluted him with tears in his eyes. "You fought for us. Now we fight for you." Daniel nearly broke down hearing that. Then came the knock that changed the entire case. Rebecca returned carrying another file. "You need to see this." Inside were financial records. HOA financial records. Anonymous source. Potentially devastating. Daniel flipped through pages. Luxury restaurant charges. Spa expenses. Vacation reimbursements. All billed to HOA funds. Thousands upon thousands of dollars. And Cynthia's name appeared everywhere. Daniel looked stunned. She used HOA money for this. Rebecca nodded slowly. If these records are authentic, we're not talking about bad leadership anymore. We're talking about fraud. The situation had officially escalated beyond neighborhood drama. This was becoming a legal disaster. That evening, Maple Ridge residents gathered outside Daniel's home again. But this time, it wasn't just neighbors. Local veterans, community leaders, even city officials. News cameras lined the street. Frank Jensen raised a small American flag. Then he spoke loudly. "This neighborhood forgot what community means." Daniel Brooks reminded us. Applause erupted. Daniel looked overwhelmed. Then someone in the crowd shouted, "Did you hear the HOA might not even own his property?" The crowd exploded with laughter. Phones came out instantly. People started posting updates online in real time. Inside her house nearby, Cynthia watched from behind closed blinds. And for the first time, fear truly entered her face, because she realized something horrifying. This was no longer a fight she could win, and the truth about Maple Ridge was only beginning to surface. Most people thought the story ended after Cynthia Holloway lost a position. They were wrong. The real consequences were only beginning. 3 days after the emergency HOA meeting, 2 black SUVs pulled into Maple Ridge Estates. No HOA logos. No local police markings. Federal investigators. The entire neighborhood noticed immediately. Curtains moved. Phones came out. Whispers spread house to house. "They're here." Investigators entered the former HOA office carrying boxes. Hours later, they left carrying even more. Computers, financial records, hard drives, documents, everything. By evening, news stations confirmed it. Federal housing authorities had officially opened an investigation into Maple Ridge HOA operations. Potential fraud, disability discrimination, misuse of homeowner funds, retaliatory enforcement practices. The scandal exploded nationwide. Daniel sat quietly watching the coverage on television. Ranger rested at his feet. Part of him still couldn't believe how quickly everything changed. Weeks earlier, he was alone, targeted, humiliated. Now the entire country knew his name, and people were standing with him. That afternoon, Rebecca Torres arrived again. "This case is bigger than we thought." Daniel frowned. "How much bigger?" Rebecca opened another folder. Former residents have started contacting us. Dozens, then hundreds. Elderly homeowners fined aggressively. Disabled residents targeted. Military families harassed over flags and modifications. One widow nearly lost a house after delayed payments during cancer treatment. Another veteran paid thousands in unlawful fines out of fear. Daniel looked sick hearing it. She did this to all these people. Rebecca nodded. "For years." The deeper investigators looked, the uglier it became. Cynthia allegedly manipulated violation reports, ignored legal protections, used selective enforcement, and according to leaked internal messages, specifically targeted vulnerable residents because they were less likely to fight back. That revelation enraged the public. National veterans organizations demanded accountability. Civil rights groups became involved. Even state lawmakers started discussing HOA reform legislation. Suddenly, Daniel's story became a symbol. Not just one veteran, not just one neighborhood, a nationwide conversation. Meanwhile, Cynthia Holloway disappeared from public view. Rumors spread quickly. Her husband allegedly moved out temporarily. Several friendships ended. Her employer placed her under internal review. And every time her name appeared online, the backlash intensified. But then came another shocking twist. One former HOA accountant stepped forward publicly. Anonymous interview, distorted voice, hidden face, and devastating claims. According to the accountant, Cynthia deliberately increased fines against Daniel after he challenged her publicly during a prior HOA meeting. She wanted to break him financially. That sentence spread everywhere. Daniel watched the interview in silence. His hands tightened slowly, because deep down, he already knew it was true. Then one evening, there was another knock at his door. Daniel opened it carefully. Standing outside was Cynthia, alone. No designer smile, no sunglasses, no confidence. She looked exhausted, defeated. Daniel stayed silent. Cynthia swallowed hard. "I need to speak with you." Daniel considered closing the door, but instead he quietly said, 5 minutes. She stepped inside awkwardly. Ranger immediately positioned himself between them. Cynthia looked around the modest living room. Family photos, military awards, pictures of Daniel and his late wife. The humanity she ignored for months suddenly surrounded her. Finally she spoke. "I never thought things would go this far." Daniel stared at her. "That's a problem." Silence. Cynthia's eyes watered slightly. "I was trying to protect property values." Daniel almost laughed. "You tried to destroy a disabled veteran over grass and paint." "I know." "No, I don't think you do." The words hit hard. Daniel leaned forward. "You know what war teaches people? That life changes instantly. One explosion, one phone call, one bad day, and suddenly you need compassion from strangers." Cynthia looked down. "But you treated compassion like weakness." She whispered quietly, "I'm sorry." Daniel remained silent, because some damage doesn't disappear with apologies. After a long pause, Cynthia stood. "I don't expect forgiveness." Daniel nodded once. "Good." She left quietly, and Daniel never saw her again. Weeks later, federal findings became public. The report was devastating. Maple Ridge HOA faced multiple violations, financial misconduct findings, discriminatory enforcement practices, potential criminal referrals. Several lawsuits followed immediately. Insurance companies withdrew coverage. The HOA nearly collapsed entirely. But something beautiful also happened. The residents rebuilt the neighborhood together. Without fear, without intimidation, without Cynthia, neighbors created volunteer committees instead of punishment systems. Veterans were honored publicly. Accessibility improvements became protected. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Brooks. Not because he wanted attention, but because he refused to surrender. One Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood organized a community barbecue in his honor. Children played outside. Flags waved. Music filled the street. Frank Jensen handed Daniel a small wooden plaque. Engraved words, "To the man who reminded us what community means." Daniel stared at it silently. Then emotion finally hit him. After everything, the war, the injuries, the loneliness, the harassment, he realized something powerful. He wasn't fighting for a house in the mall. He was fighting for dignity. And he won. 6 months later, Maple Ridge Estates looked completely different. Not physically. The same houses remained. The same streets, the same trees, but the people had changed. Fear no longer controlled the neighborhood, and everyone knew why. Daniel Brooks, the disabled veteran the HOA tried to remove, the the man who refused to break. On a warm summer evening, neighbors gathered once again outside Daniel's house. But this time there were no cameras, no protests, no anger, just community. Children rode bicycles through the street. Families laughed together. Music played softly from portable speakers. The atmosphere felt peaceful, real. Frank Jensen flipped burgers near the driveway while Melissa arranged folding chairs. Even new residents had heard the story. Maple Ridge became known nationally as the neighborhood that stood up against corruption. And strangely enough, that reputation brought people closer together. Daniel sat comfortably on his porch beside Ranger, watching, smiling quietly. A little girl approached him carrying crayons and paper. "Mr. Brooks." He looked down. "Yes, I made this for you." She handed him a drawing. It showed Daniel standing beside an American flag while neighbors surrounded him. At the top, written in crooked handwriting, "Our hero." Daniel's eyes watered instantly. He thanked her softly, then looked across the street. Months earlier, those same windows had silent neighbors too afraid to speak. Now people waved openly, talked openly, protected each other openly. That change mattered more than any lawsuit, more than any headlines, more than any public victory, because communities survive through courage, and courage spreads. Later that evening, Rebecca Torres arrived carrying exciting news. The county finalized everything today. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Everything?" Rebecca smiled. "Your property officially remains outside HOA authority permanently." The crowd cheered. Frank nearly dropped his drink laughing. So after all this, they never had control over his house. Rebecca grinned. "Not legally." People shook their heads in disbelief. The irony became legendary. An HOA destroyed itself trying to evict a man they never even had authority over. But Rebecca had one more surprise. The county also approved a new community protection policy inspired by this case. Everyone listened carefully. HOAs across the region must now provide additional protection for disabled residents and veterans before issuing penalties. The neighborhood applauded loudly. Daniel looked stunned. His fight had created actual change. Real change. Not just for him. For thousands of people. That realization hit deeply. For years after returning from war, Daniel struggled feeling useful. The injuries changed everything. Pain followed him daily. So did memories. He often believed his best years were behind him. But now, he understood something important. Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes the biggest battles happen at home. As the sun began setting, Frank tapped the glass gently. "All right, everybody. Before we eat, I want to say something." The crowd quieted. Frank looked toward Daniel. "When this started, most of us stayed silent. We saw the harassment. We saw the unfair treatment. But we looked away because it felt easier." Several neighbors nodded shamefully. Frank continued. "Daniel could have left, could have surrendered, could have stopped fighting." He smiled softly, but instead, he reminded us what courage looks like. The crowd applauded again. Daniel shook his head modestly, but Frank wasn't done. This neighborhood changed because one man refused to accept injustice quietly. Then he raised a cup. "To Daniel Brooks." Everyone raised drinks. "To Daniel." Daniel looked emotional. He slowly stood using his cane. The crowd quieted again. He looked around carefully. At neighbors, at children, at friends, at the life rebuilt around him. Then he spoke. "When I came home from war, I thought the hardest battles were behind me." Silence filled the street. But pain changes people. Loss changes people. Loneliness changes people. He glanced toward his late wife's photo visible through the front window. "There were days I honestly believed nobody would notice if I disappeared." Several neighbors looked heartbroken hearing that. Daniel smiled faintly, but then something happened. This neighborhood woke up. People listened closely. You chose kindness over fear. You chose community over silence. And that matters more than you realize. He paused. "In the Army, we learn nobody survives alone. Not in combat. Not in life." The quiet became emotional. Daniel looked around one final time. "So if there's one thing I hope people remember from all this, it's simple." He pointed gently toward the crowd. Stand up for each other before it's too late. Complete silence, then thunderous applause. Some people cried openly. Others hugged each other. Even teenagers stopped scrolling phones to listen, because everyone understood something in that moment. Daniel Brooks didn't just save his house. He saved the soul of the neighborhood. As darkness settled over Maple Ridge Estates, porch lights glowed warmly across the street, not because HOA rules demanded it, but because neighbors finally cared again. Daniel sat back down beside Ranger. The breeze moved softly through the trees. Children laughed in the distance. And for the first time in many years, the veteran who almost lost everything finally felt home again. The end.